The last $5. In the ancient city of Hanamura, where winter had draped its soft white blanket across the sloping rooftops and the paper lanterns glowed like small moons against the evening snow, there lived a man named Kenji Murakami. He had made his home in a small makeshift shelter beneath the curved wooden bridge near the old temple district, where the frozen stream lay silent beneath its layer of ice, and the pine trees stood like patient guardians wrapped in snow. His tent was humble, fashioned from blue tarpaulin and salvaged cloth, held together with careful knots and quiet perseverance. But it was his sanctuary, and within its modest walls, he had created something that resembled peace. Kenji was 64 years old, though the gentle creases around his eyes and the silver threads woven through his once dark hair suggested a soul that had weathered many more seasons than the calendar might reveal. His face was kind, weathered like the stones of the old temple walls, and his eyes held the soft warmth of tea lights flickering in a quiet room. He moved with a careful grace these days, his movements measured and unhurried, as if he had learned long ago that rushing served no purpose when one had nowhere particular to be. There was a dignity in the way he carried himself that no circumstance had managed to diminish, a quiet pride that came not from possessions or status, but from something deeper, something that lived in the marrow of his being. The morning of that particular January day began like a whispered prayer. Kenji woke to the soft hush of fresh snow falling outside his shelter, each flake descending with the patience of a meditation. The world beyond his tarpaulin walls had been transformed overnight into a landscape of pure white, and the usual sounds of the city seemed muffled and distant, as if Hanamura itself had drawn a blanket over its head and decided to sleep a little longer. He lay still for a moment, feeling the familiar coolness of winter pressing against the walls of his shelter, listening to his own breath form small clouds in the frigid air. Slowly, with the careful movements of a man who had learned to conserve his energy, Kenji sat up and reached for the worn blanket that served as both his bed and his comfort. It was a patchwork thing, sewn together from scraps he had collected over the years, each square holding its own small story. There was a piece of blue cotton from a shirt someone had donated at the shelter 3 winters ago, a square of soft flannel that had once been part of a child's pajamas, left in a donation bin near the train station, a corner of silk, deep burgundy, that he had found caught on a fence post behind one of the old merchant houses, perhaps torn from a kimono during some long-forgotten celebration. He wrapped the blanket around his shoulders and reached for the small camp stove he kept carefully positioned near the entrance of his shelter. It was a precious possession, given to him by a kind monk from the temple up the hill, and Kenji treated it with the reverence one might show a sacred object. He lit the flame with practiced hands, and soon the soft blue glow pushed back against the winter cold, creating a small circle of warmth in the frozen morning. As the water in his dented kettle began to warm, Kenji allowed his mind to drift, as it often did in these quiet moments before the world fully woke. He thought of the life he had once known, not with bitterness, but with the gentle melancholy of someone remembering a dream upon waking. He had been a music teacher once, many years ago, at a small school in the neighboring prefecture. He had taught children to play the piano, had watched their small fingers learn to dance across the keys, had witnessed the moment when understanding would dawn in their young eyes and music would flow from somewhere deep within them. Those had been good years, wrapped in the warmth of purpose and belonging. He had lived in a modest apartment above a noodle shop, and the smell of broth and the sound of laughter had drifted up through his floorboards each evening. He had owned a piano of his own then, an old upright with ivory keys that had yellowed with age, and he would play for hours as the sun set over the city, filling his small rooms with melodies that seemed to speak of things beyond words. But life, as it so often does, had other plans. The school had closed when enrollment dwindled. His savings had slowly evaporated, first to rent, then to food, then to medical bills when his heart had grown weak and required attention. There had been no family to turn to, no safety net to catch him when he fell. His parents had passed when he was young, and he had never married, never had children of his own, though he had loved the students who passed through his classroom as if they were his own flesh and blood. The kettle began to whisper, not quite a whistle, but a gentle murmur that told Kenji the water was ready. He poured it carefully over the tea leaves he had salvaged from a discarded tin behind the tea house on Plum Street. The leaves were old, their flavor faded, but they still released their essence into the hot water, turning it a pale amber that steamed in the cold air. Kenji wrapped both hands around the cup, feeling the warmth seep into his joints, and took a slow, grateful sip. Outside, the snow continued to fall with its soft, relentless patience. Through the gap in his shelter's entrance, Kenji could see the world transforming moment by moment, the familiar shapes of the bridge and the pine trees becoming softer, rounder, gentler under winter's careful touch. A crow called somewhere in the distance, its voice muffled by the falling flakes, and then settled into silence once more. Kenji reached into the small wooden box where he kept his most precious possessions. There was a photograph there, faded and creased from years of handling, showing a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. His mother, captured in a moment of joy during some long-ago spring festival, cherry blossoms caught in her dark hair. There was a harmonica, tarnished but still capable of producing sweet sounds when Kenji pressed it to his lips. And there was a small cloth wallet, hand-stitched by one of his former students as a gift, containing everything he had in the world. He opened the wallet and counted what lay inside. $5. It was all that remained from the small kindnesses of the past week. The coins dropped into his cup by passers-by, the single bill pressed into his hand by an elderly woman who had stopped to talk with him about the weather. $5 would not buy much, but it was something, a small buffer between himself and complete emptiness. Kenji tucked the wallet carefully back into the box and finished his tea in slow, meditative sips. The morning was still young, and there was no need to venture out into the cold just yet. He would wait until the midday hour, when the sun might peek through the clouds and offer whatever warmth it could, when the streets would be busier with people who might spare a moment, or a coin, for an old man sitting quietly beneath the bridge. For now, he would simply be. He would listen to the snow falling, watch the steam rise from his cup, feel the gentle pulse of his own heart beating its patient rhythm. These simple things had become enough. Perhaps they had always been enough, and he had simply taken too long to notice. The hours passed with the slow grace of winter days. Kenji dozed for a while, his blanket pulled close, his breath coming in soft, even measures. He dreamed of music, as he often did, of concert halls filled with golden light and the sounds of instruments weaving together in perfect harmony. In his dreams, he was young again, his fingers dancing across piano keys, his heart full of all the songs he had yet to play. When he woke, the quality of light had shifted. The clouds had thinned somewhat, allowing a pale sun to filter through, casting long shadows across the snow. Kenji stretched slowly, feeling his joints protest before settling into grudging cooperation, and began to prepare himself for his afternoon in the city. He dressed carefully in layers, each one adding a small measure of warmth against the bitter cold. A thermal undershirt, thin but surprisingly effective, donated by the temple's charity drive. A wool sweater, slightly moth-eaten but still serviceable, found in a bin behind the thrift store. His heavy coat, army green and too large for his thin frame, given to him by a kind stranger 2 winters past who had seen him shivering and simply taken off his own coat and handed it over without a word. Kenji had tried to refuse, but the man had already walked away, disappearing into the crowd like a spirit. He wrapped a scarf around his neck, pulled a knit cap over his silver hair, and tucked his feet into the boots that had been with him for more years than he could remember. They were worn and patched, the soles held on with careful applications of glue and hope, but they kept the snow out well enough if he stepped carefully. With his meager supplies tucked into a canvas bag and his precious $5 safe in the wallet against his chest, Kenji emerged from his shelter into the transformed world. The snow had stopped falling, leaving behind a landscape of pure white that seemed to glow with its own inner light. The bridge above him was draped in white, and icicles hung from its curved railings like crystal ornaments. The pine trees stood tall and patient, their branches bowed under the weight of winter's gift. Kenji walked slowly along the path that led from the creek up toward the main street of the temple district. His boots left deep impressions in the fresh snow, a trail marking his passage through this quiet world. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the faint scent of incense from the temple above, and the distant aroma of food being prepared in the restaurants along Lantern Street. As he walked, Kenji noticed the small beauties that winter had scattered across his path. A perfect icicle hanging from a stone lantern, catching the light and breaking it into tiny rainbows. A pair of sparrows huddled together on a snow-covered branch, their feathers puffed against the cold. A child's red mitten, lost and half-buried in a drift, waiting to be found. These small things brought a gentle smile to Kenji's weathered face. The world, he had learned, was always offering gifts to those who took the time to notice. He reached Lantern Street and found his usual spot near the entrance to the small shrine that stood at the corner. It was a good place, sheltered somewhat from the wind by the shrine's wooden walls, visible enough to passers-by but not so prominent as to cause offense. Kenji settled onto the small mat he had brought with him and arranged his cup on the ground before him, a simple ceramic vessel with a chip on its rim that someone had deemed unworthy and discarded. The afternoon foot traffic was light, as it often was in such cold weather. Most people hurried past with their heads down, their collars turned up against the chill, their minds focused on reaching their destinations as quickly as possible. A few glanced at Kenji as they passed, their eyes sliding over him with the practiced indifference of city dwellers who had learned to unsee certain things. He did not judge them for it. He understood that looking too closely at suffering could be its own kind of pain. A young woman stopped and dropped a few coins into his cup, murmuring a soft blessing before hurrying on. An elderly man paused to exchange a few words about the weather, his breath forming clouds in the cold air, before pressing a small bill into Kenji's hand with a gentle squeeze. These small kindnesses warmed Kenji more than any fire could, reminding him that even in the coldest seasons, human warmth persisted. The afternoon light began to fade, the pale sun slipping behind the mountains that ringed the city, and the temperature dropped with renewed intention. Kenji was preparing to gather his things and return to his shelter when he heard it, a sound that cut through the quiet of the winter evening like a blade through silk. It was the sound of a child crying. Kenji looked up and saw him, a small boy perhaps 7 or 8 years old, standing alone near the entrance to the shrine. He was dressed in a school uniform, the dark blue jacket and gray trousers of the local elementary school, but his coat seemed too thin for such weather, and his bare hands were red with cold. He was crying with the absolute abandon of a child who has reached the end of his resources, tears streaming down his round cheeks, his small body shaking with sobs. Something in Kenji's chest tightened at the sight. He knew that kind of crying, the kind that came when the world seemed too big and too cold and too frightening to bear. He had cried that way himself long ago, standing in a hospital corridor after learning that his mother would not be coming home. Slowly, carefully, Kenji rose from his mat and approached the child. He moved gently, not wanting to frighten him, keeping his hands visible and his posture open and unthreatening. The boy looked up as Kenji drew near, his eyes wide and red-rimmed, his lower lip trembling. "Little one," Kenji said softly, his voice carrying the warmth of all the children he had ever taught. "What troubles you on such a cold evening?" The boy sniffled, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. I lost my bus money, he managed between hitching breaths. My grandmother is waiting for me. She will be so worried. The bus costs $5 and I lost my coin purse and I do not know how to get home and it is so cold and I am scared. Kenji felt his heart ache with a familiar pain. He knew what it was to be lost and cold and frightened. He knew what it was to feel that no one in the great wide world could help. Without hesitation, without a moment's pause to consider what it would mean for himself, Kenji reached into his coat and withdrew his precious wallet. He opened it and took out the $5 bill, the only money he had in the world, and pressed it gently into the boy's cold little hand. Here, he said softly, go home to your grandmother. She is waiting for you. The boy looked down at the money in his hand, then up at Kenji's kind, weathered face. His crying had stopped, replaced by an expression of wonder and gratitude that seemed far too large for such a small face. But mister, the boy said, this is your money. Do you not need it? Kenji smiled, and the smile reached all the way to his eyes, crinkling the corners and filling his face with warmth. I have everything I need, he said. A warm shelter, a cup for tea, and now the knowledge that you will make it home safely. That is more than enough for one old man. The boy threw his small arms around Kenji's waist, hugging him with the fierce, unguarded affection that only children possess. Kenji felt tears prick at his own eyes as he gently patted the boy's back, feeling the thin shoulder blades beneath the inadequate coat, the trembling that was part cold and part lingering fear. Thank you, the boy whispered. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Go now, Kenji said gently, steering the boy toward the bus stop that stood at the far end of Lantern Street. The bus will be here soon. Your grandmother is waiting. The boy nodded and began to run, his small legs carrying him through the snow, clutching the $5 bill like a treasure more precious than gold. At the corner, he stopped and turned back, waving at Kenji with both hands, his face split by a smile that seemed to light up the gathering dusk. Then he disappeared around the corner, and Kenji was alone once more. The old man stood for a long moment in the falling twilight, feeling the cold press against him now that the warmth of the encounter had faded. His wallet was empty. He had nothing now, nothing but the clothes on his back and the shelter beneath the bridge and the memory of a child's grateful smile. And somehow, standing there in the snow as the stars began to appear one by one in the darkening sky, Kenji felt richer than he had in years. He gathered his things slowly, his joints protesting the cold, and began the walk back to his shelter. The lanterns along the street were being lit now, their soft glow creating pools of amber light against the snow. The shrine bell rang once, twice, its deep tone echoing across the quiet district, marking the passage of another day. Back beneath the bridge, Kenji prepared for what he knew would be a difficult night. He had no money now for food, no buffer against the hunger that was already beginning to make itself known in the hollow of his stomach. But he had faced hunger before, had learned to make peace with it, to treat it as a temporary companion rather than an enemy. He lit his small camp stove, more for warmth than anything else, and melted snow for water in his dented kettle. The tea he made was weak, the leaves having given all they had to give, but the warm liquid soothed his throat and settled into his stomach like a gentle embrace. He wrapped himself in his patchwork blanket and listened to the night sounds of the city, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional bark of a dog, the soft whisper of wind through the pine branches above. As he drifted toward sleep, Kenji thought of the boy, imagining him safe and warm in his grandmother's arms, telling her about the kind old man who had given him bus fare. He thought of all the children he had taught over the years, wondered where they were now, hoped they were happy and warm and loved. He thought of music, of melodies that still lived in his heart, even though he had not touched a piano in years. And in that state, between waking and dreaming, Kenji felt a peace settle over him that had nothing to do with comfort or security. It was the peace of having done something good, of having chosen kindness when the world had given him every reason to choose otherwise. It was the peace of knowing that even in his poverty, he still had something to give. The night deepened around him, the stars wheeling slowly overhead, the snow glittering in the moonlight like scattered diamonds. Somewhere in the distance, a temple bell rang the midnight hour, its tone carrying across the sleeping city like a blessing. And beneath the old stone bridge, wrapped in his patchwork blanket, Kenji Murakami slept the deep, dreamless sleep of the truly content. The days that followed brought a particular kind of cold that seemed to seep into everything, into the stones of the old buildings, into the bare branches of the trees, into the very bones of those who ventured outside. Kenji weathered it as he always did, with patience and perseverance, with small rituals of warmth and moments of unexpected beauty. Without money, he relied on the kindness that had always sustained him. The monks at the temple on the hill shared their morning rice with him, as they had done many times before, their faces gentle and non-judgmental as they passed him a bowl still steaming in the cold air. The owner of the small noodle shop on Plum Street sometimes left a container of broth by the back door, placed there as if by accident but always appearing at the moment Kenji needed it most. The elderly woman who ran the tea house often forgot to collect the leaves from her afternoon pots, leaving them in a small pile near the garden gate where Kenji might find them. These kindnesses wove together into a net that caught him each time he threatened to fall. They reminded him that he was not truly alone, that the threads connecting human beings to one another could stretch thin, but rarely broke entirely. He accepted these gifts with gratitude, always offering what he could in return: a swept pathway, a carried package, a kind word spoken at just the right moment. But the cold was relentless, and Kenji could feel it working on him in ways he could not ignore. His cough, a persistent companion that had lived in his chest for years, grew deeper and more frequent. His joints ached with an intensity that made each movement a small act of courage. And there were moments, in the darkest hours before dawn, when he wondered if this winter might be his last. He did not think of death with fear. He had lived long enough to understand that it was simply another passage, another doorway, leading to whatever came next. But there were things he still hoped to do, small tasks left unfinished, words left unsaid. He hoped for a little more time, not for his own sake, but for the sake of the moments he might yet share, the kindnesses he might yet offer. On the third day after his encounter with the crying boy, the morning dawned gray and heavy. The sky thick with clouds that promised more snow. Kenji woke slowly, his body reluctant to leave the relative warmth of his blankets, his mind still foggy with dreams of music and warmth and distant laughter. He lay still for a long moment, listening to the world wake around him, gathering his strength for another day. When he finally emerged from his shelter, shuffling toward the creek to splash cold water on his face as he did each morning, he noticed something unusual in the quality of the light. It was brighter than it should have been, as if something was reflecting the gray winter sun with unusual intensity. He looked up, squinting against the glare, and saw it. A car was parked on the street above the bridge. But not just any car. It was a limousine, long and black and gleaming, its surface so polished that it seemed to glow against the white snow around it. It looked utterly out of place in the quiet temple district, like a creature from another world that had somehow wandered into this ancient neighborhood of wooden shrines and stone lanterns. Kenji stared at it for a long moment, confusion and curiosity warring in his tired mind. Such vehicles did not belong here. They belonged in the financial district, in front of grand hotels and corporate headquarters, not on the narrow streets where monks walked in their simple robes and old women carried baskets of vegetables from the morning market. As he watched, The rear door of the limousine opened, and a figure emerged. It was a man, tall and distinguished in a long dark coat. His silver hair swept back from a face that bore the marks of authority and success. He moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being in charge, but there was something else in his bearing, a tension, an uncertainty that seemed at odds with his polished appearance. Behind him, another figure emerged, a small figure, a child in a dark blue school jacket. The boy. Kenji's breath caught in his chest as recognition flooded through him. It was the same child he had helped 3 days ago, the crying boy with the lost bus money, the same round face and bright eyes. But now the boy was smiling, practically bouncing with excitement as he tugged at the tall man's hand and pointed toward the bridge. "There, grandfather," the boy said, his voice carrying across the quiet morning. "That is where he lives, the kind man who gave me his money." The distinguished man looked down at his grandson, then up at the bridge, then at the small figure of Kenji standing frozen by the creek's edge. For a long moment, the two men simply looked at each other across the snowy distance, separated by years and circumstances and all the invisible barriers that society erected between those who had and those who had not. Then the man began to walk forward, his polished shoes leaving neat impressions in the snow, his grandson running ahead of him with the impatience of childhood. The boy reached Kenji first, throwing his arms around the old man's waist just as he had 3 days before, his small body warm and vibrant against Kenji's cold frame. "I told grandmother all about you," the boy said, his words tumbling out in an excited rush. "I told her how kind you were, how you gave me your money so I could get home, how you smiled at me and made me feel safe. And she told grandfather, and grandfather said we had to find you. We had to thank you properly." Kenji gently patted the boy's back, overwhelmed and uncertain, not knowing what to say or do. This was not how things worked in his world. Kindnesses were given and received quietly, without fanfare, without follow-up. They were like stones dropped into a still pond, creating ripples that spread outward and eventually disappeared. The distinguished man had reached them now. Up close, Kenji could see the lines of his face more clearly, the marks of age and responsibility, but also something softer, something that suggested a heart capable of great feeling beneath the polished exterior. His eyes were the same shape as the boy's, warm and bright, and they studied Kenji with an intensity that seemed to pierce through all the layers of worn clothing to the person underneath. "My name is Takeshi Yamamoto," the man said, his voice deep and measured. "This is my grandson, Hiro. He has told me what you did for him 3 days ago." Kenji bowed slightly, a gesture of respect ingrained from childhood. "I only did what any decent person would do," he said quietly. The child was cold and frightened. "I had what he needed. It was a simple thing." "A simple thing," Takeshi repeated, and something shifted in his expression, a softening, a deepening. "Mr. Murakami, do you know what $5 means to a man in your position?" Kenji blinked, surprised to hear his own name spoken. He had not given it to anyone. He had not spoken it aloud in so long that it sounded strange to his ears, like a word from a language he was slowly forgetting. "I know what it means," he said, "but I also know what a frightened child means. The child was more important than the money. It was never a difficult choice." Takeshi was silent for a long moment, his eyes never leaving Kenji's face. The snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes drifting down from the heavy sky, landing on the shoulders of their coats, on the boy's dark hair, on the bare branches of the trees above. "May I ask you something, Mr. Murakami?" Kenji nodded. "How long have you lived here, beneath this bridge?" The question was gentle, free of judgment, carrying only genuine curiosity. Kenji considered it carefully before answering. 7 years, he said at last. 7 winters, 7 springs. The bridge has been kind to me. The creek keeps me company. Takeshi's jaw tightened, a muscle flickering in his cheek. 7 years, he murmured. 7 years in the cold, and still, when a child needed help, you gave everything you had. He reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope, thick and cream-colored, sealed with a small gold emblem. He held it out to Kenji, his hand steady, despite the emotion that seemed to be gathering behind his eyes. I would like to offer you something in return, he said, not as payment for what you did cannot be paid for, but as a gesture of gratitude, and perhaps as the beginning of something new. Kenji looked at the envelope, then back at Takeshi's face. I did not help your grandson for reward, he said, and there was no reproach in his voice, only simple truth. I don't expect anything in return. I know, Takeshi said. That is exactly why I want to give it to you. He pressed the envelope into Kenji's hands, closing the old man's cold fingers around it with both of his own. His grip was warm and firm, and Kenji could feel the calluses on his palms, the marks of someone who had worked with his hands at some point in his life, despite his current air of wealth and position. Please, Takeshi said, open it. With trembling fingers, Kenji broke the seal and looked inside. His breath stopped. His heart seemed to pause mid-beat. The world around him went very quiet and very still. Inside the envelope was money, more money than Kenji had seen in years. But it was not just money. There was also a card, heavy and embossed, and on the card was an address and a name and a promise written in elegant calligraphy. I am the chairman of Yamamoto Industries, Takeshi said, and his voice seemed to come from very far away. We build pianos, Mr. Murakami. We have built them for 3 generations. And 3 days ago, when my grandson came home safely because of your kindness, my wife asked me to find you and thank you properly. So I made some inquiries. I learned who you were. I learned that you were once a music teacher. I learned that you had given everything, and that you were still giving. Kenji's hands were shaking. The card blurred before his eyes as tears he could not control began to fall. He had not cried in so long. He had thought perhaps he had forgotten how. The card is an offer of employment, Takeshi continued. We need someone to tune pianos in our workshop, someone with good ears and gentle hands, someone who understands that music is more than sound, that it is connection, that it is love. The job comes with a small apartment above the workshop, warm and dry, with a piano of your own. I cannot, Kenji whispered, and he did not know if he was refusing or simply stating the impossibility of what was happening. I am old, I am sick, I have nothing to offer. You have everything to offer, Takeshi said, and his voice cracked on the words, revealing the emotion he had been holding so carefully in check. You have a heart that gives when it has nothing to give. You have hands that have taught children to make beauty. You have a soul that sees a crying child and chooses kindness over survival. He paused, gathering himself. My grandson asked me why you would give him your last. Money. Do you know what I told him? Kenji shook his head, unable to speak. I told him that some people carry so much love inside them that it spills over even when they have nothing else. I told him that meeting someone like you is a gift, and that gifts must be honored. Young Hiro stepped forward and took Kenji's hand in his small one. His fingers were warm, his grip surprisingly strong for such a small child. Please come, Mr. Murakami, the boy said, looking up at Kenji with those bright, earnest eyes. Please come and tune pianos and be warm. Grandmother is making soup. She makes the best soup. She said I could have extra if I brought you home. A sound escaped Kenji, something between a laugh and a sob. He looked down at the child, at this small messenger of grace who had appeared in his life like a character from an old folk tale, and he felt something shift inside him. Something that had been frozen for a very long time beginning to thaw. I will need to gather my things, he heard himself say. My blanket, my mother's photograph. There is not much, but it is mine. Takeshi nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Of course. Take all the time you need. We will wait. And so, on that gray winter morning, with snow falling softly around them and a child's hand warm in his own, Kenji Murakami began to pack up his small life beneath the bridge. He moved slowly, carefully, treating each object with the reverence it had earned through years of faithful service. The patchwork blanket, the dented kettle, the photograph of his mother with cherry blossoms in her hair, the harmonica that still made sweet sounds when he pressed it to his lips. The limousine driver came forward to help, a young man with kind eyes who handled Kenji's meager possessions as if they were precious treasures. They loaded everything into the trunk of the great black car, and then Kenji stood for a moment, looking at the shelter that had been his home for 7 years. It was just a tarpaulin and some salvaged cloth, held together with knots and hope. It was nothing, really, and yet it had kept him alive. It had given him a place to dream, a place to remember, a place to be. Thank you, he whispered, not knowing if he was speaking to the shelter or the bridge or the frozen creek or the universe itself. Thank you for everything. Then he turned and walked toward the limousine, where young Hiro was bouncing excitedly in the back seat, and Takeshi Yamamoto was holding the door open, waiting. As the car pulled away from the temple district, carrying Kenji toward a future he could not have imagined, he looked out the window at the world he was leaving behind. The bridge grew smaller in the distance, then disappeared around a corner. The snow continued to fall, already covering the spot where his shelter had stood, erasing the evidence that anyone had ever lived there at all. But Kenji knew the truth. He knew that he had lived there. He knew that he had survived there. And he knew that somewhere, in the great mysterious workings of the universe, his survival had been preparing him for this moment, this crossing, this new beginning. The limousine was warm. The leather seats were soft. Young Hiro was chattering excitedly about the piano workshop and the apartment and the soup his grandmother was making. And Kenji Murakami, formerly homeless, formerly hopeless, formerly lost, sat very still and let the warmth seep into his old bones and thought about second chances and small kindnesses and the strange, beautiful ways that life could surprise you when you least expected it. The Yamamoto Piano Workshop sat on a quiet street in the artisan district of Hanamura, a neighborhood of narrow lanes and wooden facades where craftspeople had practiced their trades for generations. It was a building of modest size but substantial presence, its walls aged to a soft gray that spoke of decades of dedication, its entrance marked by a simple sign bearing the Yamamoto name in elegant brushstrokes. Kenji's first steps across its threshold felt like stepping into a dream. The interior was warm and filled with a golden light that seemed to emanate from the very wood of the walls. Pianos stood in various stages of completion throughout the workshop, their frames exposed like skeletons waiting to be clothed in their proper skins. The air smelled of lacquer and sawdust and something else, something that Kenji recognized immediately and that made his heart ache with longing. Music. The smell of music, if such a thing could exist. The accumulated residue of thousands of notes played, of countless hands moving across keys, of decades of songs rising up through the air and seeping into the walls. Kenji breathed it in and felt something inside him come alive again, something that had been sleeping for so long he had almost forgotten it was there. Takeshi introduced him to the workshop staff, a small group of dedicated craftspeople who had spent their lives learning the intricate art of piano making. There was Mr. Suzuki, the master woodworker, whose hands could coax impossible shapes from blocks of raw timber. There was Mrs. Tanaka, who handled the delicate work of fitting the felt hammers that would strike the strings. And there was young Yuki, an apprentice with bright eyes and an eager smile, who reminded Kenji so much of his own students from years ago. They welcomed Kenji with bows and warm words, treating him not as a charity case, but as a colleague, a fellow craftsman joining their ranks. Takeshi had clearly spoken to them beforehand, had prepared them for his arrival, and their kindness seemed genuine and unforced. The apartment above the workshop was small but perfect. A single room with a tatami floor, a tiny kitchen in one corner, a bathroom with a deep soaking tub that Kenji could already imagine sinking into after a long day of work. There was a futon, thick and clean, with blankets that smelled of fresh laundering. There was a small table with cushions for sitting, and there, positioned near the window where the light fell soft and golden, was a piano. Not a new piano, not one of the gleaming instruments that sat in the showroom downstairs. This one was old, its wood darkened with age, its keys yellowed to the color of old ivory. But Kenji could see that it had been lovingly maintained, that every scratch and worn spot told a story of use and love and music made over many, many years. "It was my grandfather's," Takeshi said, standing in the doorway while Kenji explored his new home. "He built it himself, back when the workshop was just a small shed behind his house. It is not valuable in the commercial sense, but it is precious to our family. I thought perhaps you might like to have it here." Kenji's hand trembled as he reached out to touch the keys. They were smooth beneath his fingertips, worn by decades of play. He pressed one gently, and the note that emerged was pure and true, hanging in the air like a gift. "I do not know how to thank you," he whispered. "I don't have words." "You don't need words," Takeshi said. "You have already thanked me. You thanked me 3 days ago when you gave my grandson his life back." The days that followed were a gradual awakening, like spring slowly softening a landscape that had been frozen for too long. Kenji learned the rhythms of the workshop, the early mornings when the craftspeople arrived with their cups of tea and their quiet greetings, the long hours of concentrated work broken by shared meals and conversation, the evenings when the tools were put away and the silence descended like a blessing. His job was to tune the finished pianos, to bring them to that state of perfect pitch where every note rang true and clear. It was delicate work, requiring both technical skill and something harder to define, a sensitivity to sound that could not be taught but only cultivated through years of patient listening. Kenji discovered that his ears had not forgotten their training, that the knowledge he had built up over a lifetime of teaching was still there, waiting to be used again. He worked slowly at first, his hands remembering movements they had not made in years. The tuning fork became an extension of his arm. The tiny adjustments to the pins that held the strings became second nature. And gradually, note by note, piano by piano, he found his way back to the craft he had thought he had lost forever. The other workers grew to appreciate his presence. They came to him with questions about tone and resonance, trusting his experienced ear to catch what they might miss. They shared their lunches with him, brought him tea when he forgot to eat, told him stories about the pianos they had built and the musicians who had played them. He became part of their community, woven into the fabric of their daily lives in ways he had thought were no longer possible for someone like him. Young Hiro visited often, sometimes with his grandmother, a small woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, who looked at Kenji with an expression that seemed to see straight through him. Her name was Michiko, and she spoke little, but when she did speak, her words carried weight. "My grandson has not stopped talking about you," she said one afternoon, watching as Kenji taught Hiro how to hold his hands above the piano keys. "He says you are the kindest person he has ever met." "I am just a man who was in the right place at the right time," Kenji said. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Michiko said, and her voice was firm. That is not true. Most people would have looked away. Most people would have said it was not their problem. You chose to see him. You chose to help. That is not common, Mr. Murakami. That is rare. She pressed a small package into his hands before leaving, a bundle wrapped in cloth that turned out to contain several pairs of warm socks and a new scarf, hand-knitted in soft wool the color of forest moss. Kenji held them to his face and breathed in the smell of yarn and kindness, and felt something crack open in his chest that he had thought was long since sealed. The weeks passed, and winter softened into early spring. The snow melted from the rooftops, the cherry trees began to show their first tentative buds, and Kenji Murakami, who had spent 7 years beneath a bridge, began to believe that this new life might actually be his. He grew stronger on the regular meals that Michiko insisted on providing. His cough faded as the warm, dry air of the apartment worked its healing. His joints loosened as he used them again, as he climbed the stairs to his room and walked to the market for vegetables, and stood for hours at the pianos, coaxing them toward perfection. He began to play again in the evenings after work, sitting at his grandfather's piano and letting his fingers remember the songs they had once known. At first the music came haltingly, like a language half forgotten, but slowly it returned, melody by melody, chord by chord. He played the songs he had taught his students. He played the songs his mother had sung to him when he was small. He played new songs that seemed to emerge from somewhere deep inside him, songs about loss and redemption and the strange grace of second chances. One evening, Takeshi came to his door and asked if he might listen. Kenji, embarrassed, tried to refuse, but Takeshi was insistent, and so Kenji played, while Takeshi sat on the floor with his eyes closed. And when the last note faded into silence, Kenji saw that there were tears on the older man's cheeks. "That was beautiful," Takeshi said. "That was the most beautiful thing I have heard in years." "I am out of practice," Kenji said. "My technique is poor. I am sure your ears must be offended." "My ears," Takeshi said, "are grateful. They have heard too many perfect performances from people with no soul. They needed to hear something true." He was quiet for a moment, and then he asked a question that Kenji had been dreading. "Mr. Murakami, may I ask what happened to you? How did a man of your talents come to live beneath a bridge?" Kenji was silent for a long time. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with all the years of loss and struggle that lay behind it. He did not want to speak of those years. He did not want to revisit the pain, the slow slide from security into uncertainty, the gradual loss of everything he had built. But there was something in Takeshi's face, a genuine concern that demanded honesty. And so, Kenji began to speak. He told Takeshi about the school where he had taught, the small institution in the mountains where children from the surrounding villages had come to learn music. He told him about the joy he had found there, the purpose and meaning that had filled his days. He told him about the slow decline of enrollment as families moved away and budgets tightened, about the day when the headmaster had called him into his office and told him, with genuine sorrow, that the school could no longer afford to keep him. He told Takeshi about the years that followed, the search for new employment that always seemed to end in closed doors and apologetic faces. He was too old, they said, too set in his ways. The world had moved on to new methods, new approaches, and there was no place for an old-fashioned teacher who still believed in the slow, patient work of developing young souls. He told Takeshi about the apartment above the noodle shop, about the gradual depletion of his savings, about the day when he could no longer pay the rent and had found himself on the street with nothing but a suitcase and a harmonica and a photograph of his mother. And he told Takeshi about the 7 years under the bridge, about the cold winters and the hot summers, about the small kindnesses and the everyday cruelties, about the way time seemed to stretch and compress in strange ways when you had nowhere to be and nothing to do but survive. When he finished speaking, The room was very quiet. The evening light had faded while he talked, and now they sat in semi-darkness, two men bound together by circumstances neither could have predicted. "I am sorry," Takeshi said at last. "I am sorry that the world treated you so poorly." "The world treated me as it treats many," Kenji said. "I was not special in my suffering. There are thousands like me, millions perhaps, sleeping under bridges and in doorways, waiting for someone to see them." "But someone should have seen you sooner," Takeshi said, and there was anger in his voice now, a controlled fury at the injustice of it all. "Someone should have recognized your value. Your gifts should not have been wasted for 7 years. "They were not wasted," Kenji said gently. "I taught children to make music for 30 years. Even if I never touch another piano, those lessons still live in the hearts of my students. They still play the songs I taught them. They still pass on what they learned. Nothing is wasted, Mr. Yamamoto. Everything contributes to the whole." Takeshi was silent, considering this. Then he leaned forward, his face illuminated by the last rays of the setting sun. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Something I have never told anyone outside my family." Kenji nodded, waiting. "My grandfather, the man who built this company, who made the piano you now play, he too was homeless once. He too knew what it was to sleep in the cold, to go hungry, to be invisible to the world." Kenji's eyes widened. "I did not know. Few people do. It is not part of our official history, but it is true. My grandfather came to Hanamura with nothing. He had lost his family in a fire when he was young. He lived on the streets for years, doing whatever work he could find, sleeping wherever he could find shelter. And then one day, a piano tuner took pity on him, gave him a job, taught him the trade, and from that small kindness, my grandfather built everything you see around you." He gestured at the workshop below them, at the pianos waiting to be completed, at the warm apartment where Kenji now lived. "When Hiro told me about you, about the old man who gave him his last $5, I knew immediately that I had to find you. Not because I felt obligated, not because I wanted to repay a debt, but because I recognized something in your story. I recognized my grandfather. And I thought to myself, this is why we are here. This is what all of this is for. Not to make money, not to build a reputation, but to continue the chain of kindness that began so many years ago." Kenji felt the tears coming again, and this time he did not try to stop them. They flowed freely down his weathered cheeks, dropping onto his hands, onto the keys of the old piano that had belonged to a man who had once been as lost as he. "I do not know what to say," he whispered. "Say nothing," Takeshi said. "Just keep playing, keep tuning, keep being the person you have always been. That is all the thanks I will ever need." Spring came to Hanamura like a blessing long awaited. The cherry trees exploded into bloom, their delicate pink petals drifting through the streets like fragrant snow. The air warmed and softened. The days lengthened, and Kenji Murakami found himself falling in love with life again. He had forgotten what it felt like to wake each morning with a sense of purpose. He had forgotten the satisfaction of work well done, of problem solved, of beauty created through patient effort. He had forgotten the pleasure of conversation, of sharing meals with friends, of belonging to something larger than himself. The workshop became his second home, and the people who worked there became his family. He learned their stories, their hopes, their dreams. He celebrated with them when things went well and comforted them when things went wrong. He became, without quite realizing it, a kind of grandfather figure to the whole establishment, someone to whom the younger workers came for advice and the older workers came for companionship. Young Hiro visited nearly every day after school, eager to continue the piano lessons that Kenji had begun giving him. The boy had talent, Kenji could see that, a natural affinity for music that went beyond mere technical ability. He had the gift of feeling the music, of letting it flow through him rather than simply playing the notes on the page. "You remind me of myself at your age," Kenji told him one afternoon, watching as Hiro struggled with a particularly difficult passage. So eager to get it right, so frustrated when it does not come immediately. "How did you learn to be so patient?" Hiro asked, his small brow furrowed with concentration. "I did not learn," Kenji said. "I was forced. Life taught me that some things cannot be rushed, that the good things, the truly valuable things, take time to develop. You cannot hurry spring. You cannot hurry the growth of a tree. And you cannot hurry the development of a musician. You can only practice and wait and trust that the work you put in today will bear fruit tomorrow." Hiro considered this with the seriousness of a much older person. "Is that what you did when you lived under the bridge?" he asked. "Did you practice patience?" The question caught Kenji off guard. No one else had been so direct about his past, had addressed it so openly. But children, he remembered, had always been honest. It was one of the things he loved most about them. "Yes," he said slowly. "I suppose I did. Every day under the bridge was a kind of practice. I practiced accepting what I could not change. I practiced being grateful for small things. I practiced keeping hope alive even when everything seemed hopeless." "That sounds very hard," Hiro said. "It was," Kenji admitted. "But it also taught me things I could not have learned any other way. It taught me what truly matters. It taught me that kindness is more valuable than money, that connection is more important than comfort, that every person, no matter their circumstances, has something precious to offer the world." "Like you offering me your money," Hiro said. "Like that, yes. And like your grandfather offering me this job, and like the monks at the temple sharing their rice with me, and like the woman who gave me my coat. Kindness flows in a great river, Hiro. We dip into it when we need to, and we add to it when we can. And the river never runs dry because there are always people willing to give." Hiro was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then he turned back to the piano and began to play again, and this time the difficult passage came smoothly, flowing from his fingers as if it had always been there, waiting to be released. As the weeks passed, Kenji's health continued to improve. The persistent cough that had plagued him for years faded to nothing. His joints loosened and strengthened. He began to walk more upright, to move with a confidence he had thought lost forever. The workshop doctor, who examined him every month at Michiko's insistence, expressed amazement at his transformation. "You have gained 10 years, the doctor said, shaking his head in wonder. "I have never seen such a dramatic recovery. What is your secret?" "Warmth," Kenji said. "Good food, meaningful work, and love." It was true. He could feel love flowing through his days now, coming from unexpected directions, filling spaces he had not known were empty. There was the love of the workshop community, the camaraderie and mutual support that bound them together. There was the love of Hiro, fierce and uncomplicated, given freely and without reservation. There was the quiet love of Michiko, expressed in knitted socks and bowls of soup and sharp-eyed attention to his well-being. And there was the profound love of Takeshi, the recognition of a kindred spirit that had transformed Kenji's life completely. One evening, as the cherry blossoms were beginning to fade and the first hints of summer warmth were creeping into the air, Takeshi came to Kenji with an unusual request. "I would like you to play at a concert," he said. "A small gathering at our showroom. We do one every spring to showcase our new instruments. This year, I would like you to be our featured performer." Kenji's first instinct was to refuse. It had been too long since he had performed publicly. His technique was still recovering. He was not worthy of such an honor. But Takeshi would not accept no for an answer. "You are exactly the person I want," he said. "Not because you are the most technically accomplished pianist, not because you will impress people with your virtuosity, but because when you play, people feel something. They connect to something true and real. That is what our pianos are meant to do. That is what I want to show people." And so, on a warm evening in late spring, Kenji found himself sitting at a beautiful new Yamamoto grand piano in the center of the showroom, surrounded by an audience of perhaps 50 people. They were a mixed crowd, some wealthy patrons, some fellow craftspeople, some friends and family of the workshop staff. Hiro sat in the front row next to his grandmother, his eyes wide with anticipation. Kenji's hands trembled as he placed them on the keys. The room was very quiet. He could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on him. For a moment, he feared he would not be able to play, that the music had abandoned him, that he would sit there frozen while the silence stretched on and on. And then he thought of the bridge. He thought of the cold nights and the warm days, of the hunger and the loneliness, of the small kindnesses that had kept him alive. He thought of the crying boy and the $5 and the limousine that had appeared like a miracle in the gray winter morning. He thought of all the years of teaching, of all the students whose lives he had touched, of all the music he had helped bring into the world. And he began to play. The music that emerged from the piano was unlike anything the audience had heard before. It was not technically perfect. There were small hesitations, moments of uncertainty, passages that a professional critic might have marked as flawed. But there was something else there too, something that transcended technique, something that reached directly into the hearts of those who listened. It was the sound of a life lived fully, with all its joys and sorrows, its triumphs and failures, its moments of despair and its moments of grace. It was the sound of resilience and hope, of love given and received, of kindness passed from hand to hand like a precious gift. It was the sound of a man who had lost everything and found it again, who had touched the bottom of human experience and risen back to the surface carrying treasures that could not be bought or sold. When Kenji finished playing, there was a moment of profound silence, and then the audience began to applaud, not politely, but with genuine emotion, with tears in their eyes and wonder in their faces. They rose to their feet, still clapping, and Kenji sat at the piano with his head bowed, overwhelmed by the response, by the realization that his music still had the power to move people. Hiro ran to him and threw his arms around his neck. Michiko wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. Takeshi stood at the back of the room, watching with an expression that seemed to hold all the pride of a father for his son. Later, after the audience had departed and the showroom had been tidied and the last of the wine had been drunk, Kenji sat alone on a bench outside the workshop, looking up at the stars. The night was warm and clear, and the heavens stretched above him like a vast dark canvas studded with points of light. He thought about his mother and how she would have loved to see him play tonight. He thought about his students, scattered across the world now, perhaps making music of their own. He thought about all the people who had helped him along the way, the monks and the shop owners and the strangers who had shown him kindness when he had nothing to offer in return. And he thought about the $5. It was such a small thing, really. A single bill, crumpled and worn, pressed into the hand of a crying child. He had not thought about it much at the time. It had simply seemed like the right thing to do. But from that small seed, this entire garden had grown. This new life, this new family, this music that was pouring out of him again after so many silent years. The universe, Kenji reflected, worked in mysterious ways. It gave and it took. It built up and it tore down, and sometimes, just sometimes, it surprised you with a grace so profound that it took your breath away. He sat there for a long time, watching the stars wheel slowly across the sky, feeling the peace of the night settle around him like a warm blanket. And when at last he rose and climbed the stairs to his small apartment, he felt something he had not felt in many years. He felt complete. He felt whole. He felt home. The summer deepened, bringing with it long golden days and soft, warm evenings. The workshop hummed with activity as orders flowed in from across the country, from concert halls and music schools, and private collectors who had heard about the beautiful instruments being crafted in this small corner of Hanamura. Kenji's days fell into a comfortable rhythm. Mornings were for tuning, that delicate work that required all his concentration and skill. He would move from piano to piano, listening for imperfections invisible to untrained ears, making the tiny adjustments that brought each instrument to its perfect pitch. It was meditative work, almost like prayer, and he found himself entering a state of calm focus that seemed to wash away all the troubles of the world. Afternoons were for teaching. Word had spread about the old tuner who gave piano lessons to the chairman's grandson, and soon other parents were approaching Kenji, asking if he might take on their children as well. At first he was reluctant, uncertain if he still had the energy and patience that teaching required, but Takeshi encouraged him, and Michiko insisted, and before long Kenji found himself with a small class of eager students who came to the workshop after school. Teaching them was like rediscovering a part of himself he had thought was lost. He remembered what it felt like to watch a child's face light up when they finally mastered a difficult passage. He remembered the joy of sharing knowledge, of passing on skills that had taken a lifetime to acquire. He remembered why he had become a teacher in the first place, all those decades ago when he was young and full of dreams. Evenings were for playing. After the students went home and the workshop grew quiet, Kenji would climb the stairs to his apartment and sit at his grandfather's piano, letting the music flow from his fingers. Sometimes he played pieces he had known for years, old favorites that felt like comfortable clothes. Sometimes he improvised, letting his fingers wander where they would, discovering melodies he had never heard before. One evening, as the summer sun was setting in a blaze of orange and pink, there was a knock at his door. He opened it to find Takeshi standing in the hallway, holding a wooden box. "May I come in?" Takeshi asked. "I have something to show you." Kenji stepped aside, and Takeshi entered, setting the box carefully on the small table. He opened it to reveal a stack of papers, yellowed with age, covered in handwriting that Kenji did not recognize. "These belong to my grandfather," Takeshi said. "They are compositions he wrote when he was young, before he started the piano business. I found them last week, tucked away in an old trunk in the storage room. No one has looked at them in decades." Kenji leaned forward, examining the papers with curiosity. The handwriting was cramped but legible, and he could see musical notation flowing across the pages, complex arrangements that spoke of a sophisticated musical mind. "He was a composer?" Kenji asked. "A would-be composer," Takeshi said. "He gave it up when he started the business. There was no time for such things," he said. "Building pianos was practical. Writing music was a dream." "These look remarkable," Kenji said, tracing the notes with his finger. "Have you ever heard them played?" Takeshi shook his head. "No one has played them since my grandfather stopped. He never let anyone look at them. I think perhaps he was ashamed of the dreams he had abandoned." He looked at Kenji with an expression that seemed almost shy, uncertain, a marked contrast to his usual confidence. "I was wondering," he said, "if you might play them, if you might bring my grandfather's music back to life." Kenji felt something stir in his chest, a mixture of honor and trepidation. To play another person's forgotten compositions, to give voice to dreams that had been silent for so long, it was a sacred responsibility. "I will try," he said. "I cannot promise they will sound as your grandfather intended, but I will do my best to honor his vision." He began that very evening, working his way through the first composition, a gentle nocturne that seemed to capture the feeling of moonlight on water. It was beautiful and melancholy, full of longing for something just out of reach. Kenji played it slowly, carefully, listening to each phrase, trying to understand what the young man who wrote it had been feeling all those years ago. The days that followed were consumed by the compositions. Kenji worked through them one by one, mastering their technical demands, searching for their emotional heart. Some were joyful, exuberant celebrations of life and love. Others were dark and brooding, speaking of loss and disappointment. Together, they formed a portrait of a complex young man, talented and ambitious, passionate and frustrated, dreaming of great things while building pianos in a small workshop in an ancient city. When Kenji had finally mastered all the compositions, he invited Takeshi and his family to his apartment for a private recital. They gathered in the small room as the evening light faded, Takeshi and Michiko sitting on cushions, young Hiro cross-legged on the tatami floor, and Kenji played. He played the entire cycle of compositions, from the gentle opening nocturne to the triumphant finale, a sweeping piece full of hope and determination. As he played, he watched the faces of his audience, saw the emotions washing across them, the recognition of something precious being returned to them after a long absence. When the final note faded into silence, no one spoke. Michiko was crying quietly, her handkerchief pressed to her eyes. Takeshi sat very still, his hands clasped in his lap, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the walls of the room. Hiro looked from adult to adult, uncertain what he was feeling, but knowing it was important. Finally, Takeshi spoke. His voice was rough with emotion. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for bringing my grandfather back to us." Kenji bowed his head, feeling the weight of the moment. He had done what he could. He had given voice to silent dreams. And in doing so, he had repaid a debt that could never truly be repaid, honoring the man whose kindness had started the chain that had led, generations later, to the saving of his own life. Autumn arrived with its usual pageant of color, the mountains surrounding Hanamura transforming into a tapestry of red and gold. The air grew crisp and clear, and the first hints of wood smoke began to drift through the streets as residents prepared for the coming winter. Kenji marked the anniversary of his arrival at the workshop with quiet reflection. 1 year. It had been 1 year since he had climbed into the limousine with young Hiro, leaving behind the bridge and the creek, and the life he had known for 7 long years. In that time, everything had changed. He was stronger now than he had been in a decade. The regular meals, the warm shelter, the meaningful work had restored his body in ways that still surprised him. His cough was gone. His joints moved easily. He could climb the stairs to his apartment without pausing for breath. But more than his body had healed, his spirit had been restored too. The loneliness that had been his constant companion under the bridge had dissolved, replaced by connection and belonging. The despair that had sometimes threatened to overwhelm him had lifted, replaced by hope and purpose. The feeling of invisibility that had haunted his homeless years had vanished, replaced by the certain knowledge that he was seen, valued, loved. On the anniversary evening, Takeshi organized a small celebration at the workshop. The staff gathered in the showroom, which had been decorated with autumn leaves and candles. There was food and drink, laughter and conversation. Kenji's students performed some of the pieces he had taught them, and Takeshi gave a speech that made Kenji duck his head in embarrassment. 1 year ago, Takeshi said, we welcomed a new member to our family. He came to us from difficult circumstances, but he brought with him a wealth of experience and wisdom that has enriched all of our lives. He has tuned our pianos, taught our children, and reminded us every day what truly matters in this world. To Kenji Murakami, with gratitude and love. The toast was echoed around the room, and Kenji felt the warmth of their regard surrounding him like a physical embrace. He had been blessed. He knew it, and he would spend whatever time remained to him trying to be worthy of that blessing. As the evening wound down and the guests began to drift home, Kenji found himself standing alone by the window, looking out at the moonlit garden. The maple tree in tea. The corner had turned a brilliant red, and its leaves seemed to glow in the silver light. Young Hiro appeared at his elbow, his face thoughtful. "Mr. Murakami," he said, "may I ask you something?" "Of course. Are you happy now?" Kenji considered the question carefully. It was not a simple one. Happiness was a complicated thing, multifaceted and ever-changing. It was not a destination to be reached, but a way of traveling. "I am content," he said at last. "I am grateful. I am at peace. Whether that is the same as happy, I am not sure. But I believe it is enough." Hiro nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "I am glad," he said. "I was worried when grandfather said you used to live under a bridge. I thought maybe you would still be sad inside, even though you are warm now. But you do not seem sad." "I am not sad," Kenji said. "I have been sad. I may be sad again someday. But right now, in this moment, I am filled with something very close to joy." He placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "And do you know why?" Hiro shook his head. "Because of you," Kenji said. "Because a small boy cried on a cold street corner, and I was able to help him. Because that small act of kindness set in motion a chain of events that led me here, to this place, to this family, to this life. You, Hiro, are the reason I have everything I have, and I will be grateful to you for the rest of my days." Hiro's eyes widened, and then his face broke into a smile so bright it seemed to light up the entire room. "I am glad I lost my bus money," he said. "I am glad I was crying. Otherwise, we would never have met." Kenji laughed, a sound that came from somewhere deep inside him, warm and true. "The universe works in mysterious ways," he said. "Sometimes the things that seem like disasters are actually doors. We just have to be brave enough to walk through them." Winter came again, as it always did, draping Hanamura in its familiar blanket of white. But this year, Kenji watched its arrival without fear. He had a warm place to sleep, food to eat, work to do, people who loved him. The cold was just the cold now, not an enemy to be survived, but a season to be experienced. He continued his work at the workshop, tuning pianos with growing skill and teaching students with renewed energy. Hiro had progressed remarkably under his guidance, and Kenji could see in the boy the same spark he had recognized in his most talented students from years past. Someday, he knew, Hiro would become a musician of real accomplishment. Takeshi's grandfather's compositions had been published, with Kenji credited as the performing artist on the accompanying recording. The collection had attracted attention from music lovers across the country, bringing new recognition to the Yamamoto workshop and ensuring that a forgotten man's dreams would live on long after those who remembered him had passed. The recording money, which Takeshi insisted Kenji keep entirely, was more than the old man had ever expected to have again. He donated most of it to the temple, which used it to expand their program for homeless individuals. The rest he spent on gifts for his students and supplies for the workshop. "You should keep something for yourself," Takeshi said when he learned what Kenji had done with the money. "You deserve comfort, security," but Kenji just smiled and shook his head. "I have everything I need," he said, "more than I need. The best thing I can do with money is make sure it helps others the way I was helped. That is how the river flows. That is how kindness stays alive." One snowy evening, as Kenji was preparing for bed, there was a knock at his door. He opened it to find a small package on the threshold, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. There was no note, no indication of who had left it. Inside was a photograph in a simple wooden frame. It showed a young man with kind eyes and a gentle smile, standing next to an upright piano in what looked like a small workshop. The young man was Takeshi's grandfather, captured in a moment before the years had worn him down, before the dreams had been set aside, before he had built the empire that now bore his name. On the back of the frame, in Michiko's elegant handwriting, were the words, "For Kenji, who gave his music back to us. With love, always." Kenji placed the photograph on the small table beside his bed, where he could see it first thing each morning and last thing each night. It would remind him of the strange connections that bound people together across time and circumstance, of the way kindness echoed through generations, of the truth that nothing good is ever truly lost. He sat down at his piano and began to play the Nocturne, the first of the grandfather's compositions, the piece that had started everything. The notes rose into the quiet room, filling it with their gentle melancholy, and outside the window the snow continued to fall, soft and silent, covering the world in white. The years that followed were gentle ones, marked by the slow rhythms of work and rest, of seasons changing and relationships deepening. Kenji grew older, his hair turning entirely white, his movements slowing, but his spirit remained vital, his love of music undimmed. He taught dozens of students over the years, sending them out into the world carrying the gift he had given them. Some became professional musicians. Others simply carried with them the joy of being able to make music, a skill that enriched their lives in countless ways. All of them remembered the old man who had taught them not just technique, but feeling, not just notes, but meaning. Hiro grew from a boy into a young man, tall and handsome like his grandfather, with the same warm eyes and gentle manner. He studied music at university and returned to Hanamura to work at the family business, learning the craft of piano making while continuing to play with increasing skill. Kenji watched his progress with pride, knowing that he had played some small part in shaping the person Hiro had become. The workshop prospered, its reputation growing year by year. Musicians from around the world came to Hanamura to try the Yamamoto instruments, praising their beautiful tone and responsive touch. And always, when they asked about the secret of the piano's quality, Takeshi would tell them about the tuner, the old man who had been homeless until a small act of kindness changed his life. The story became legend, passed from mouth to mouth, embellished and simplified in equal measure. The homeless man and the crying boy. The $5 that changed everything. The limousine that stopped at the tent. It was a story people wanted to believe. A story that suggested the universe was not random and cruel, but ordered and kind. That small acts of goodness could ripple outward and transform the world. Kenji did not particularly like being the subject of such a legend. He had not helped Hiro in order to be rewarded. He had helped because it was the right thing to do, because a child was suffering and he had the power to ease that suffering. The reward, while welcome, had been unexpected. He would have helped even knowing nothing would come of it. But he understood why people needed the story. They needed to believe that kindness mattered, that the good they did would not be forgotten, that the universe kept track and eventually settled accounts. And if his story could strengthen that belief, could inspire others to be a little more generous, a little more compassionate, then perhaps it was worth being a legend after all. On his 75th birthday, Kenji's family, for that was how he thought of them now, organized a celebration that exceeded anything he could have imagined. The workshop was transformed into a concert hall, filled with chairs for the many guests who had been invited. Former students came from across the country, now adults with families of their own. Musicians he had tutored sent messages of congratulation. Even some of the homeless individuals who had been helped by his temple donations attended, cleaned up and dressed in their best clothes, grateful for the chance to thank the man whose generosity had given them a second chance. Kenji was overwhelmed. He sat in a place of honor at the front of the room, surrounded by people who loved him, watching as one by one they came forward to share memories and express gratitude. Stories were told that he had forgotten. Kindnesses he had shown that had long since slipped from his mind. It was like watching his life played back before him, a montage of small moments that had accumulated into something larger than he had realized. The highlight of the evening was a performance by Hiro, now a young man of 21, playing the nocturne that had started everything. He played it beautifully, with a maturity and depth of feeling that brought tears to Kenji's eyes. When he finished, he came to where Kenji sat and knelt before him. "Thank you, Sensei," he said, using the formal term of respect. "Thank you for teaching me. Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for saving my life on that cold day so long ago." Kenji placed his weathered hands on Hiro's young ones. "You saved mine," he said. "Never forget that. You saved mine." The final years of Kenji's life were peaceful and full. He continued teaching as long as he was able, then retired to a routine of rest and reflection, still living in the small apartment above the workshop, still playing his piano each evening as the sun set over the mountains. He thought often about his life, about the strange path it had taken, the heights and depths, the losses and the gifts. He thought about his mother and hoped she could see him now, warm and loved and at peace. He thought about his students, scattered across the world, carrying forward the music he had taught them. He thought about the crying boy on the street corner and the $5 that had changed everything. On the last night of his life, a quiet evening in late spring when the cherry blossoms were just beginning to fall, Kenji sat at his piano and played. He played all the pieces he loved best, the compositions of Takeshi's grandfather, the songs his mother had sung, the melodies he had taught to generations of students. He played until his fingers grew tired and the night grew late and the stars wheeled slowly overhead. Then he closed the lid of the piano, climbed into his bed, and fell asleep. He did not wake again. They found him the next morning, peaceful and still, a gentle smile on his face. The workshop was closed for a week in mourning. The funeral was held at the temple on the hill, the same temple whose monks had once shared their rice with a homeless man living beneath a bridge. Hiro played at the service, the nocturne one final time, and when he finished, there was not a dry eye in the room. Takeshi spoke about kindness and legacy, about the ripples that spread outward from small acts of goodness, about a man who had given his last $5 to a crying boy and received in return more than he could ever have imagined. They buried Kenji beneath a cherry tree in the temple garden, where each spring the blossoms would fall upon his resting place, like a gentle blessing. A simple stone marked the spot, bearing only his name and the years of his life. But beneath the dates were carved 3 words: "He gave everything." And in a way, it was true. Kenji Murakami had given everything he had over and over again, his money and his music and his time and his love. He had given without expectation of return, without calculation of benefit. He had given because that was who he was, because in a world that could be cold and cruel, he had chosen to be warm and kind. And in the end, everything he had given had come back to him, multiplied beyond measure. He had died rich, not in money, but in love. He had died full, not of food, but of meaning. He had died peaceful, knowing that his life had mattered, that he had made a difference, that the world was a little bit better because he had been in it. And somewhere in the mysterious realm beyond this life, perhaps a mother with cherry blossoms in her hair was waiting to welcome her son home, to tell him that she was proud, that she had always been proud, that his music had been beautiful from the very beginning. If you are listening to this story in the quiet darkness of your room, perhaps it is time now to let your eyes grow heavy, to feel your body sinking deeper into the comfort of your bed. The story of Kenji Murakami has come to its end, but the truth it carries continues on, gentle and persistent, like a melody that plays on even after the last note has faded. Let your breathing slow and deepen now, matching the peaceful rhythm of your heart. Feel the weight of the day lifting from your shoulders, dissolving into the soft embrace of the night. There is nothing you need to do right now, nothing you need to fix or solve or figure out. There is only this moment, this breath, this gentle passage into rest. Think of kindness as you drift towards sleep. Think of the small acts of goodness you have witnessed and performed, the moments when someone reached out to help without expecting anything in return. These moments matter. They ripple outward through time and space, touching lives you may never see, creating chains of grace that stretch from heart to heart across the world. You are part of this chain. Everything you have given, every smile and kind word and helping hand, has contributed to the great river of human compassion that flows eternally through the darkness, bringing light wherever it goes. Your kindness has mattered. It will always matter. Nothing good is ever truly lost. Let your mind grow still now, like a pond settling after a breeze has passed. Let your thoughts become clouds drifting across a peaceful sky, present but not demanding attention, floating by and dissolving into the soft blue emptiness beyond. There is nothing to hold on to. There is nothing to resist. There is only the sweet surrender of consciousness to the welcoming arms of sleep. Feel the blankets around you like the embrace of everything that is good and gentle in the world. Feel the pillow beneath your head like a cloud of pure comfort, supporting you, cradling you, keeping you safe. You are warm, you are protected, you are loved. Perhaps, in your dreams tonight, you will hear music. Perhaps you will hear the nocturne that Kenji played, the gentle melody that spoke of moonlight on water, of longing and hope, and the mysterious beauty of existence. Let that music wash over you. Let it carry you deeper into the realm of rest. Let it remind you that even in the darkest nights, beauty persists, kindness endures, and love finds a way. And perhaps, somewhere in the landscape of your dreams, you will meet an old man with silver hair and kind eyes, sitting at a piano in a warm room, playing songs that seem to speak directly to your soul. He will smile at you, this old man, and in his smile you will see all the warmth and wisdom of a life well lived. He will play for you, and you will listen, and together you will share a moment of perfect peace. Sleep now, rest now, let the world take care of itself while you drift in the gentle waters of unconsciousness. The morning will come soon enough, with its demands and responsibilities, its challenges and opportunities. But that is for later. For now, there is only this sweet descent into dreams, this blessed release from the weight of waking. May your sleep be deep and restorative. May your dreams be peaceful and kind. May you wake tomorrow feeling refreshed and renewed, carrying with you the quiet certainty that life is good, that kindness matters, and that you are exactly where you need to be. Good night, dear listener. Good night. The stars are wheeling slowly overhead. The snow is falling softly outside, and somewhere, in a small apartment above a piano workshop in an ancient city, the ghost of a beautiful melody still lingers in the air, patient and eternal, waiting to be heard again. Sleep now, rest now, you are safe, you are loved, you are home.